Hello and welcome to this workshop on news literacy, part of the Citizen Literacy series here at the Cal Poly Pomona University Library. Now, in this workshop, we're going to discuss the news, what it is, how it gets made, the difference between reporting and editorializing, and the phenomenon of infotainment and how it has led to a lot of the current messes in our country. But to start out with, we should probably address what all this has to do with citizen literacy. What does the news have to do with citizenship at all? In truth, a whole lot. One of the fundamental freedoms laid out in the First Amendment is that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the freedom of the press. So freedom of the press, the freedom to report the news, regardless of whether or not it is flattering to those in power or those who wield great power and influence, is a crucial element in our democracy. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to a contemporary, asserted, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." As citizens in a republic, expected to use our sovereignty to select leaders for our nation, and at least in the state of California, often called upon to vote on laws that will directly affect our lives and the lives of roughly 40 million other Californians, it is imperative on us to know what is going on. Because if we don't have an accurate picture of what is going on around us, we will be unable to make informed decisions for our own future. And in the United States, one of the primary conduits from which we get that information, for good or ill, is through the news. So what is news? Well, the term news enters the English language in the early 15th century and has been relatively constant in its meaning since then as an accounting of recent events or occurrences provided as new information. And why might your average peasant farmer be interested in recent events or occurrences from abroad? Well, as had been the case for centuries and would basically remain true until the end of the 19th century, people didn't get out much. Their lives were centered around their farm or village, and news from abroad was essentially the only way they'd ever hear what was going on beyond their own sphere. So one of the primary reasons for reporting news, going back into time immemorial, was curiosity and novelty, the ability to hear something new and interesting, instead of the same old story about Wolfrich's cow getting lost or something. But beyond this basic reason, the spreading of news was often in the public interest. If there was sickness or famine or war, all of which, while far away, could still affect a village or community, it was helpful to know, before the first plague victim showed symptoms, or the first marauding band of soldiers came marching into town. Finally, while an informed populace is crucial for a democratic society, and thus less desirable for more authoritarian regimes, even absolute monarchs need their subjects to know what is expected of them. Therefore, leaders could make use of the spread of news to inform people about new laws, taxes, or levies for a war or crusade, the birth of an heir, or the passing of a monarch. These notices would either be spread through placards and broadsheets like the one you see here, or prior to widespread literacy, through the use of official messengers, such as town criers. With the advent of the printing press in the mid-15th century, the way news was spread and consumed changed rapidly in Europe. Printers began printing brief accounts of news as a way of supplementing their income, and as subscriptions to these proto-newspapers was often a more reliable source of income than larger and more expensive projects such as print runs of books. As printed news spread throughout Western Europe and literacy increased, governments throughout the region saw both the opportunity and threat posed by information sources that could broadly circulate ideas and potentially criticism of monarchs and leaders. Thus, these governments almost immediately imposed forms of censorship on published news. Printers had to be licensed by the government in order to print anything, and these licenses could be revoked at will. Published news had to be approved prior to circulation by government censors. In England, whose laws inspired our own press laws, the system of licensing and censorship would persist until the 1640s, when the English Civil War led to a breakdown of centralized royal authority. Following the victories of Parliament, censorship laws were allowed to lapse, and papers were free to publish without government oversight. However, the freedom and impact of the British press was limited by the high price of paper, which limited the size and circulation of any single paper, and Britain's strict libel laws, which allowed individuals to sue publications for publishing unflattering information about them that could be considered to have harmed them in some material way, regardless of the truth of the report. American press freedoms in the British colonies were strengthened over those of the mother country due to two major factors. First, the relatively loose and decentralized governance of the colonies up until almost the outbreak of the Revolution. And second, a ruling by the courts in the colony of New York when printer John Peter Zenger was sued for libel by the colonial governor for printing unflattering truths about him. The court ruled, in contrast to the laws in England, that the truth was indeed a defense against libel, and that printing facts, even unflattering facts about public officials, was legal. These factors, combined with the pivotal role that newspapers in the colonies played in raising public opinion in favor of the colonial cause against the British and organizing the movement towards independence, led the Founding Fathers to believe that a press largely unencumbered by censorship was crucial to the maintenance of the Republic, and thus enshrined press freedoms in the First Amendment. So news is essentially the sharing of information about current events, whether to satisfy curiosity, inform in the public interest, or serve state power. Inherent in the spreading of news is the tension between state power seeking to censor the news in the interests of control and stability, and the freedom of the press to report the truth, so that citizens can act in their interest and participate in their respective governments. Hence, in the United States, with its Republican form of government, a press largely unfettered by censorship or government control was considered to be integral to the health of the nation. So how then does this unfettered news get made? The answer to that question is a little complicated. News actually comes from many different sources. Of course, the first thing that has to happen for news to get reported is that something has to happen. An event, a crisis, a disaster, a crime, or something else worthy of note. Usually the first reporters on such an incident are eyewitnesses on the ground. These days, a lot of this comes through social media like Twitter, but in the past this might come through 911 calls, reports over a police scanner, or the like. At this point, a number of different news collection systems go into action. On the local level, reporters from local newspapers and television stations begin investigating, taking down the facts of the event, calling and interviewing sources who are either eyewitnesses to the event or individuals the reporter has cultivated in the government, industry, or the community who can be trusted to provide authoritative information on a given subject. If this is a major event in a foreign country, then only the major news services like the New York Times, CNN, NBC, CBS, etc. will have foreign bureaus, permanent offices in the area with dedicated correspondents on site with local sources. Other news sources will rely on wire service such as the Associated Press or Reuters. The AP, for instance, is a nonprofit news agency which has foreign bureaus across the globe and provides basic coverage of events worldwide to which local news services can subscribe for a fee, allowing the AP to publish or broadcast in their news sources. After the initial reporting by TV, cable news, and newspapers is done, news stories are picked up by content aggregators, or secondary news sources, such as Gizmodo or HuffPost, which basically summarize the original news story and sometimes provide a link to it. Generally speaking, these sources sacrifice detail and fact for brevity and impact, as the goal is to generate as many clicks for ad revenue as possible, making the news they provide the information equivalent of junk food. Tasty, but not terribly nutritious. They also pose a problem because they usually provide for free information that was often quite costly to collect, analyze, and report on. Foreign bureaus and wire services, not to mention flesh and blood local reporters, aren't free. And in many cases, they aren't even cheap. Hence, a lot of times the original news source is behind a paywall, as these sources attempt to recoup through subscriptions the cost of their reporting. But summarizing and linking is pretty cheap in comparison. Another problem with online content aggregators, and basically all news at this level of news production, is that they often blur the line between reporting and editorializing. Editorializing is not a new phenomenon in the publishing of news. A lot of early newspapers were almost nothing but editorializing, as the papers were essentially the mouthpiece of the publisher and like-minded writers who opined on the politics and current events of their community. As such, most of the papers of the period were fiercely partisan, with biases that would make most cable news commentators blush in comparison. Now, this is the reason why a number of American newspapers have names like Whig, Democrat, or Republican, regardless of the current politics of the area, as the names of the paper reflect their original political leanings. So let's delineate the differences between reporting and editorializing. Modern news reporting is largely an outgrowth of the creation of wire services like the Associated Press in the 1840s and a move toward greater professionalism in journalism in the early 20th century. The AP created a relatively bare-bones style of reporting that was heavily fact-driven with a minimum of commentary, so that the reports they generated could be easily incorporated into local papers across the country. This style was gradually adopted by journalists in the United States, particularly in the early 20th century, as a form of reaction to the so-called yellow journalism of the late 19th century, in which major newspaper publishers, such as William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, engaged in a subscription war to increase the circulation of their papers through increasingly polemic and outrageous headlines where impact was valued above accuracy. Another major factor in the development of modern reporting was the establishment in the early 20th century of schools of journalism at major universities, such as the schools at the University of Missouri and at Columbia University in New York, the latter, ironically, being established in a grant by Joseph Pulitzer. With the establishment of schools of journalism, new standards of ethics and accuracy entered into the profession. Perhaps the most notable development of the period was the elevation of the value of objectivity in reporting, in which the reporter was expected to convey the facts of the event with a minimum, if any, of personal commentary from the reporters themselves. So reporting, by the end of the 20th century, could be characterized by a style that privileged facts and objective portrayal of events over commentary, a professionalized corps of reporters who had gone to journalism school, and a code of ethics that valued accuracy and objectivity. This tradition stands in contrast with the far older tradition of editorialism, in which the news source served primarily as a mouthpiece for the opinions and arguments of the publisher or editor of the source. As it is focused primarily on opinion and interpretation, editorialism is unapologetically subjective and usually partisan in a political sense. For most of the 20th century, newspapers and news broadcasters attempted to maintain a separation between their news reporting and their editorial content. Hence, the Wall Street Journal could be awarded numerous prizes for excellence in reporting, particularly on business and economic issues, while simultaneously hosting an editorial page with a marked right-wing bias, with a similar situation, albeit with a center-left bias, at the New York Times. Now, in the late 20th and early 21st century, this separation between reporting and editorializing began to break down, most notably in the field of cable news, where the rise of 24-hour news networks promoted the rise of a new phenomenon, infotainment. Now, as pretty clear from the word itself, infotainment is simply enough broadcast material that is intended to both entertain and inform, which seems pretty innocuous at first glance. After all, such a term could be used to describe everything from a PBS documentary by Ken Burns to the latest episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. But what happens when infotainment becomes the dominant form of news and adopts an increasingly adversarial tone to maintain its viewership? But I'm getting ahead of myself. To start out, we need to go back to the late 1980s. At this time, broadcast news is dominated by the so-called Big Three news broadcasters, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Each of these broadcasters has been active and dominant in the American news reporting since the end of the Second World War, and their primary conduit for reporting is a 30-minute news program that would air in the evening, helmed by a well-known anchorman who would report the news. The position of anchorman goes back to legendary reporters such as Edward R. Murrow, David Brinkley, and Walter Cronkite, who combined experience in journalism with a degree of on-air gravitas and authority that made them trusted guests in the homes of most Americans. By the 1980s, these roles were filled by Dan Rather at CBS, Tom Brokaw at NBC, and Peter Jennings at ABC. However, the network's dominance of news broadcasting was about to be challenged by a new media, cable television, and the idea of a 24-hour news channel. This, of course, was CNN, which was the brainchild of media mogul Ted Turner and began broadcasting in 1980. Now, at first, the idea of a channel that existed only to broadcast news seemed kind of ridiculous. And indeed, in its early years, CNN struggled to find content and on air talent to report it. The lack of major anchor personalities led Ted Turner to argue that, unlike on the networks with their celebrity anchors, on CNN, the news was the star. In 1990, however, an event occurred that brought CNN into its own as a news broadcaster. On August 2nd of that year, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded its much smaller neighbor Kuwait, triggering an international crisis and a major intervention by the United States and allied powers against the Iraqis. Unlike the networks, who had to cut into their broadcast schedule to report on breaking news, CNN was able to continuously broadcast the events on the ground, with reporters in Baghdad when the Allied airstrikes began, and therefore was able to air footage from missiles and smart bombs provided by the United States Department of Defense. Now, as someone who was 8 to 9 years old when this happened, and whose parents watched these events unfold daily, I can attest that CNN's coverage was everywhere. But it was also entertaining. We saw war from angles we had never seen before, and unlike my parents' experience viewing Vietnam around the dinner table watching TV, this time the story was an exciting one of American power, dominance, and victory. The Gulf War effectively established CNN as the dominant force in cable news and a major competitor to the networks, and proved that news could fixate a nation's attention as much as the most popular comedies or dramas. In order to meet this new challenger, the networks invested more heavily in investigative programming to help compete with CNN's 24-hour programming. All of these broadcasters also benefited from the 1987 repeal of the Federal Communication Commission's Fairness Doctrine, which had required anyone using the public airwaves to air issues of public interest and present both sides of the issue. With the repeal of this doctrine by the Reagan administration, openly partisan programming could begin to be produced and widely distributed, beginning with an explosion of conservative-leaning talk radio on AM stations, such as that pioneered by the late Rush Limbaugh, noted on this slide. For broadcast news and cable news in particular, the removal of the requirements of the Fairness Doctrine allowed debate shows, such as Crossfire, which featured a liberal and a conservative commentator arguing about current affairs, and more programming that used partisan controversy to heighten tension and excite and entertain viewers with verbal sparring. But while CNN might be credited with the launching of this new age of infotainment, the perfection of this combination must be attributed to a different source altogether. That man would be Roger Ailes and his magnum opus, the network he helped found, Fox News. Now, if nothing else, Fox News tends to raise strong opinions and feelings among just about every ideological stripe in the country. And while I myself, in the interest of full disclosure, will admit to not being a great fan of Fox or the way they report the news, I must also admit that the massive effect and change wrought by Roger Ailes and Fox on the news landscape. Love them or hate them, Ailes and Fox's effect on the way we consume news in this country cannot be denied. Now, Roger Ailes was an interesting and controversial figure. He began his work in television as a producer of daytime talk shows during the 1960s, where he gained considerable experience in applying the techniques of television production to maximize certain effects. During the 1968 presidential election, one of the guests on the shows Ailes produced was Republican presidential candidate Richard M. Nixon. Now, Nixon had a rocky relationship with television since the 1960 presidential election, where the televised debates contrasted his sweaty and somewhat sickly appearance with that of his tanned and relaxed competitor, John F. Kennedy. People who had listened to the debate on radio felt that Nixon had clearly won, but those who viewed the debate on television couldn't get past Nixon's appearance and claimed Kennedy as the winner. These impressions carried forward to the election, which Nixon lost. 8 years later, Nixon still felt uncomfortable and reportedly dismissed television as a gimmick in front of Ailes, who, according to Ailes' own retelling, spent at least an hour explaining to Nixon the power of television for shaping public opinion. Whatever the truth, Nixon was apparently impressed with whatever he'd heard from Ailes, because he soon appointed him as a television advisor to the Nixon campaign. After assisting Nixon with his 1968 presidential victory, Ailes went on to advise a number of presidential candidates, including 1988 Republican presidential nominee George H.W. Bush. Ailes specialized in no-holds-barred attack ads, which had a mixed record of either propelling his candidates to victory or imploding their campaigns. Now, in the 1990s, Ailes played a crucial role in improving the ratings of NBC's cable business channel, CNBC, and briefly oversaw their short-lived cable live talk channel, America's Talking. After leaving NBC due to personality disputes, he teamed up with media mogul Rupert Murdoch to help launch a direct 24-hour news competitor to CNN, Fox News. Like many of Murdoch's news properties, Fox was intended to follow the conservative slant of their owner. But while Murdoch provided the cash, it was Ailes who placed the ideological stamp on Fox. Those familiar with Fox News will immediately recognize its famous taglines such as fair and balanced or we report, you decide, which undergird a network that was unapologetically partisan in its commentary shows such as Hannity and Colmes or The O'Reilly Factor, while more subtle in its biases during the reporting of straight news. The argument Fox effectively made was that, in their presenting of a right-wing version of news events, they were balancing the left-wing slant of most news media, and that the onus of determining the truth was on the viewer, not on them. What Ailes was banking on, and what he successfully harnessed, was the fact that there were millions of American conservatives who were, to some degree or another, alienated from the mainstream news media and looking for a source of information that would inform them while catering to their ideological preferences. In this, Ailes succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, as, after a rocky start, Fox took off after the 9/11 attacks to be consistently the leading source of cable news in terms of viewers. However, in creating a mainstream, explicitly ideological news source with direct and admitted conflict with other news sources over not only interpretations of facts, but sometimes the very facts themselves, Fox News' creation had an unintended consequence, contributing to and greatly exacerbating the partisan divide in the United States in the early 21st century. While Fox did not invent the partisan blogosphere, and indeed was rather late in creating a digital presence online, it greatly extended and provided a broader platform for the explicitly partisan news content that had bloomed in talk radio after the demise of the Fairness Doctrine. With the explosion of the internet and the blogosphere in the late 2000s, Fox served as a gateway to an alternate online reality in which facts became partisan talking points, and an entirely alternative worldview was now available to those unsatisfied or alienated from mainstream culture and politics. In the aftermath of the Trump administration and the attack on the Capitol while the Senate was certifying the results of the 2020 presidential election, we can begin to see the degree to which a divided and explicitly partisan news media affects everyday life in our nation. Every issue, almost without exception, becomes politicized and broken down on the left-right divide, down to the questions of the reality of a global pandemic or whether or not to vaccinate oneself and one's family. This polarization and the engagement of the more radical elements of the political spectrum have led to political gridlock and an inability of our nation to effectively confront many of the major issues that affect it. Increasing radicalization has led to the rise of political violence, armed militias, and the potential for future insurrections and continued unrest. So on that pleasant note, what can you do about any of this? The answer isn't a simple one. No one of us can change the nature of news reporting or lessen the partisan divide of the information ecosystem on our own. What we can do, individually and as a group, is determine what we will and will not consume. News, in this sense, is like food. You are what you eat. If you consume an endless supply of partisan rancor and ideological bias, your outlook on life and the way you consider the world will be shaped by the media you ingest. If, on the other hand, your media consumption, and news consumption in particular, is careful, privileging sources known for accuracy, factualness, and objectivity, and your consumption is varied across a variety of ideologies and sources, your perspective will be better rounded. So what do? Well, here are a few basic suggestions. Avoid getting your news from cable television or content farms like HuffPost. This is the news equivalent of potato chips, colorful and tasty, but ultimately unfulfilling and bad for your mental and psychological health. When getting your news online, as I expect most of you do, favor slow news done by organizations who spend a lot of time on reporting. Be willing to consider outside perspectives, not just ideologically in an American sense, but internationally, like the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, etc. Remember the difference between reporting and editorializing. And whenever you have a news source placed before you, stop and consider whether it was reporting or editorializing. And as such, how should you weigh it for accuracy and reliability? More than anything else, remember that you are citizens of a democracy, and as such, you are empowered and expected to assist in the making of the decisions that will affect not only yourselves, but generations to come. Your decisions will only be as good as the sources you use to inform yourself.